In the fall of 1983, 4 men set out to hunt deer in Virginia. One of them would never return home. Authorities determined the hunter's death was accidental, but an insurance adjuster believed otherwise. A year later, the FBI had only one option. Agents had to get the suspect's confession on tape before their witness also became the hunter's target.
Over 1,000 hunting accidents are reported in the United States each year. Fewer than 10% of them are fatal. But when one hunter's death seemed suspicious, the FBI was called in to investigate. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents would have to determine if their suspect was a grieving father figure or a man who murdered a friend in cold blood.
On November 21st, 1983, near Roanoke, Virginia, 41-year-old David Fisher hunted deer with the 3 people who were closest to him. His 16-year-old stepson, his friend 22-year-old Bobby Mulligan, and 18-year-old David Wilkey. Wilkey looked up to Fisher as the father he never had. The group had been hiking since the early morning, but no one had spotted a deer. $50 was wagered on the first to shoot one. Fisher's stepson was bored and asked to go off on his own. He told him not to go far. The teenager had little experience in the woods. He walked a short distance when he heard someone yell, "Deer." Then he heard a gunshot. The boy ran back to see if anyone had won the $50. He found the group a few yards from where he left them, sitting on the incline of a small hill. 18-year-old David Wilkey had been shot. He was still alive, but they were miles from the nearest phone. Fisher told his stepson to run and get help. 30 minutes later, he reached rescuers. Lieutenant Michael Ashworth of Virginia's Department of Game and Inland Fisheries was called in.
I received a call from the Bedford County Sheriff's Department somewhere around 3 p.m. stating that there had been a hunting accident. I proceeded immediately to the scene. It was on the south side of Bedford County off of Stone Mountain Road.
Authorities were too late. David Wilkey died before help could reach him. The lieutenant asked the hunters to describe what happened. Bobby Mulligan said that when they spotted the deer, David Wilkey got excited and ran ahead.
I see it!
Mulligan and Fisher followed behind. As he started down the slope, Mulligan explained that he slipped in the dry leaves. His gun discharged when he hit the ground. To Lieutenant Ashworth, it was clear that Mulligan was a novice with firearms since he had made such a critical error.
I said, you would have had this firearm cocked. And he said, yeah, I did. I was carrying it cocked. When I had heard the deer, then I cocked the gun, which was obvious he was very ignorant of basic safety rules.
The back,
David Fisher told the lieutenant he saw the whole thing happen from the top of the slope. He was behind the 2 younger men when the shot went off. He saw Wilkey go down and rush to the side of the fallen teenager. He told investigators he placed a rag over the wound in Wilkey's back in an effort to stop the bleeding.
Go get help now.
The father figure tried to comfort his dying friend until help could arrive. But after only a few minutes, Wilkey stopped breathing. Investigators examined the surrounding area to determine if there was any physical evidence to corroborate their story. Investigators found the spot where Mulligan had slipped.
Hey guys. Take a look here, please. Pretty good shot.
The size of the wound in Wilkey's back seemed consistent with a gunshot fired from where the hunter had hit the ground. Nothing they could find contradicted Mulligan and Fisher's story. Officials then turned their attention to the weapon that fired the fatal shot.
Yeah, it's the shotgun.
They found that it had been undisturbed since it was last fired. When the lieutenant opened the barrel, he discovered the spent cartridge was still inside. The men were not placed under arrest, but investigators asked them to come to the sheriff's office for further questioning.
Set it down.
Authorities were still uncertain if they were going to press charges against the hunters.
Come with me.
Bobby Mulligan seemed to be very sincerely remorseful. He was crying at times and talking about the fact that he had hunted very little. But it looked like that it was exactly as what it appeared to be, a simple hunting accident. And we do have accidents that occur that way.
At the station, the two men were interviewed once more in separate rooms. Their stories never changed. Unlike Bobby Mulligan, David Lee Fisher remained composed and assured his stepson that everything would be okay.
Don't be so. It's not the same.
Since the hunters had inadvertently wandered onto private land, they were charged with hunting on posted property. The man who fired the fatal shot, Bobby Mulligan, was charged additionally with reckless use of a firearm and hunting without a big game license.
Sir, being charged. Hunting without a permit.
The charges were misdemeanors.
No court date. Trespass.
Fisher and Mulligan would need to answer them in court. Until then, they were allowed to return home to Charlotte, North
You're being
Carolina.
charged.
As standard procedure, David Wilkey's body was autopsied. The cause of death was determined to be a transection of the aorta and lacerations of the lungs due to a single projectile. In addition to the 12-gauge slug, the medical examiner extracted cardboard wadding that had also been discharged from the shotgun shell. Examiners confirmed the slug was fired from Mulligan's rifle. A month later, Fisher and Mulligan defended their misdemeanor charges in Virginia's General District Court. The judge gave Mulligan a suspended sentence and fined him $585. Fisher was fined $220. The property officer returned the shotgun to the men, and the case was closed. Two days later, an insurance company received a claim on the dead boy's life insurance. The policy promised to pay $100,000 in the event that Wilkey's death was accidental. Though Wilkey's signature appeared on the forms, he was not the policy's owner. His close friend, David Fisher, was the owner and the sole beneficiary.
I don't like
This wasn't illegal, but it struck the agent as strange since Fisher wasn't listed as the boy's father, nor as his business partner.
John?
The company decided to contest the claim.
This is claiming an accidental death?
On January 6, 1984, they hired independent claims director Harlan Davis to determine if David Wilkey's death was in fact accidental.
They contacted our office and requested that we complete an investigation to determine the relationship between Bobby Mulligan, David Fisher, and David William Wilkey, and also to check police records, obtain a medical examiner's report, and to get in it and develop the circumstances surrounding this death.
Davis attempted to contact Fisher and Mulligan, but the claims director was unable to reach them. He was able to reach Wilkey's single mother in Florida.
This is Diane. Yes.
She told him that her son had left home for Charlotte, North Carolina less than a year before.
Who are you again? Oh.
The 18-year-old had heard that his estranged father was in Charlotte visiting relatives. Wilkey hadn't seen his dad since childhood. His mother said that he caught up with his father briefly, but his dad left Charlotte before they could become reacquainted. The father wanted nothing to do with him. That's when Wilkey met Fisher.
David Wilkey was looking for a father, which he didn't have. His father and mother were separated. They were distant from him. He felt like he wanted to get to know his father, and this is the reason he really fell into a relationship with David Fisher was because he was looking for this father figure, and it became a friendship.
Shortly after her son died, Fisher called to tell her that the teenager wished to be cremated, but had no life insurance. The mother believed Fisher and ordered the cremation, since Fisher seemed to have been close with her son. The claims director finally caught up with David Fisher to ask him why the policy had been purchased.
We'd like to know what
Fisher replied that Wilkey had wanted life insurance because he was planning to get married. His fiancée did not want insurance, so the 18-year-old turned to Fisher. Since Wilkey had no money, Fisher gave him a loan and a job working for him to pay it off. Fisher was the owner and operator of Fisher Services, a small business that employed several people, including Bobby Mulligan. Morgues and mortuaries called Fisher Services when they needed a body transported to their facilities from accident scenes. Fisher and his men worked mostly after 11 p.m. He didn't get paid unless people died. On a good week, the work was lucrative, but when there were no bodies to transport, he needed other ways to get paid.
This is an interesting relationship.
The investigator questioned why Fisher had paid the insurance premium if Wilkey was making income. The businessman replied that he only wrote the checks to the insurance company after Wilkey paid him first.
I don't know what else I can tell you.
Fisher had an answer for every anomaly. In spite of Fisher's deflections, the investigator managed to get an important piece of information from him. The new address of Bobby Mulligan, the man who fired the gun that killed David Wilkey.
Mulligan? Bobby Mulligan? Yeah. I'd like to ask you.
The claims director found Mulligan at a pizza parlor in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
I'd like to talk to you. First of all, would you give me your name, your address?
Mulligan didn't have much to add to what Davis had already heard.
100 Main Street.
The claims investigator concluded his inquiry in the spring of 1984. His firm gave their assessment to the insurance company.
We recommended strongly to them that they not pay the policy and that further investigation be followed up to determine any other information that might shed some light onto this shooting, that it was not exactly as it looked on the surface.
Well, would you sign
The
an
insurance
affidavit
company
to that
sent the
effect?
case to an attorney in Greensboro, North Carolina. Fisher signed an affidavit vouching that he had seen the deceased sign the policy. The lawyer asked Fisher to describe the shooting one more time. Once again, Fisher indicated that Mulligan was 15 feet behind Wilkey when the gun discharged.
Have you seen what's in
The attorney confronted Fisher with the coroner's report.
You might like to take a look at it.
2 pieces of cardboard wadding from the shotgun shell had been found inside Wilkey's chest. For the wadding to have lodged there, it was likely the shot had been fired from much closer than 15 feet. The evidence was not strong enough to prove murder, but it was strong enough to win a civil suit.
We are prepared to make you an offer.
He offered Fisher $25,000 to settle out of court, the amount the lawyer figured it would cost to defend the case. Fisher accepted.
Now, if you will sign here, please.
They were afraid that if they did not settle the claim for some amount, that David Fisher would possibly sue them for not following the law in paying a claim when he had a legitimate claim.
David Fisher had just made $25,000 from the death of David Wilkey, his friend and employee. The portion of that money he loaned to a friend would soon be paid back in ways he never expected. On a hunting trip to Virginia, 18-year-old David Wilkey's shooting death had been ruled accidental. The man the dead teenager had looked up to, 41-year-old David Fisher, had been paid $25,000 as the sole beneficiary of the boy's life insurance policy. Then, a year and a half later, in the spring of 1985, Special Agent Robert McDowell of the FBI Charlotte Field Office received a call from one of his informants.
Early on in 1985, I had a source, and one day he came to me with a story that a friend of his had been hired and refused to take the job to murder somebody for insurance money. I at first didn't understand exactly why he was bringing me this information and why this individual is willing to talk about this now.
Over the course of 2 more weeks, the agent continued to speak to his source.
Well,
The informant said his friend's name was Bear and that Bear's life was in danger. Agents wanted to speak to this person at the Charlotte FBI field office. But the source said Bear was reluctant since he was an ex-convict. He would only meet them in a neutral place. They agreed to meet in a park. Special Agent James Lillard, who's currently working undercover, helped Agent Bob McDowell develop the case.
Working right beside Bob, we asked me if I wanted to go out with him to interview his source and find out a little bit more about this information.
Lillard would keep watch from a distance in case his partner was being set up. Bear arrived on schedule. His real name was Gerald Stedham. Stedham said that a man named David Fisher was threatening his life because Stedham owed him several $1,000s from a personal loan. He also accused Fisher of murdering 18-year-old David Wilkey more than a year earlier. Agents were skeptical.
When you hear something like that, it initially sounds pretty fantastic, and you kind of scratch your head. You're thinking, is this for real or not? Stedham may have been exaggerating a little bit, and maybe he exaggerated about the story in itself.
look, I'm not wearing.
He hoped the FBI would protect him in exchange for information about his old friend David Fisher. When the agent asked if Stedham was willing to wear a wire to prove the story, the ex-convict refused.
He had his run-ins with law enforcement officers before, And he pretty much said right from the very beginning that he didn't trust police, FBI, or anybody else. So at that point, it was a matter of trying to gain Stedham's trust to the point that he would actually work with us and not back out of the situation once he started getting into it.
Agent McDowell needed to find out more about Fisher. A background check revealed that David Fisher had several aliases and 25 prior convictions for crimes ranging from larceny to forgery. Years earlier, Fisher had testified in the trial of an underworld crime figure and was then entered into the Witness Protection Program. Not long after, his protection was removed since his continuing criminal behavior was in violation of its rules. Agents also checked records in Virginia to confirm Stedham's story.
Yes, there was, in fact, a hunting accident where a gentleman by the name of David Wilkey was shot in the back, supposedly accidentally. So that in itself verified that this definitely happened. Then the next step is to find out if there are any motives here. I mean, why did this happen? And if there was any other details.
McDowell arranged another meeting with Stedham to find out more. Stedham refused to come to the FBI office. Instead, he agreed to meet in the parking lot of a local restaurant. Once again, Stedham promised to tell the FBI anything they wanted to know about Fisher, but refused to wear a wire to secure evidence. If Fisher discovered the wire, Stedham believed he would certainly be killed. He didn't trust that the FBI would protect him if his cover was blown. They were interrupted before McDowell was able to convince him.
I was speaking to him when suddenly screaming and yelling came from a local restaurant. And I realized that there was an armed robbery taking place at the time. And I asked Gerald Stedham just to step off to the side.
Move. FBI!
The thief was stopped by the agent before he could flee.
Get down!
Stedham was speechless. At first, he wondered if the agents had staged the robbery to convince him to cooperate. When he was sure the arrest was real, his attitude towards the FBI changed.
And at that point, I realized that I had gained his trust as somebody who knew what he was doing. So from that point on, it was pretty easy to be able to get Stedham to believe that we were going to protect them and be able to get the information that we needed.
How can I help you?
Well, I really think it's meeting to help you out.
At last, Stedham agreed to meet with agents in the FBI offices.
What I can do for you, it's this fellow I'm working for.
For the first time, agents learned the plan Fisher made to kill his young friend David Wilkey.
Too much to heart.
In the summer of 1983, Fisher suggested that he and Stedham, his old prison buddy, could make $100,000 from a life insurance scam. The ex-convict would take out a policy on their young friend David Wilkey if Stedham would do the killing. Despite working several odd jobs, Wilkey was poor and estranged from his family. Fisher believed no one would miss him.
His proposal was to, let's take him out into Virginia, let's take him out to an overlook, and we'll get him near the overlook, and I want you to push him off. And that way, he would die, it would look like an accident, and Fisher could collect the insurance money, and which of course he would share with him if he did it.
Well, I'm worried about...
Stedham told agents that he didn't take Fisher seriously until he learned Fisher had obtained the life insurance policy on Wilkey.
Willing to pay to kill it?
Yeah. I almost...
And at that point, Stedham said he didn't want anything to do with it. He backed out, which again made Fisher absolutely furious, to the point of almost a hatred developing between his old friend Gerald Stedham and David Fisher.
Me, one day, I remember seeing this.
A few months later, when Stedham heard that Wilkey had been killed hunting in Virginia, he knew the death was probably not accidental. Stedham told agents that Fisher later offered him $50,000 to kill the hitman, Bobby Mulligan. The informant believed that Fisher would likely come after him next.
But the unfortunate situation was that Fisher hated Stedham at this point. I mean, actually would probably kill him. So we realized that the only way we were going to be able to get at Fisher through Stedham was to have Stedham tell him that he was sorry that he hadn't paid him back and that he wanted to pay him back even if it's only $100 a week.
$100 a week would give the FBI several opportunities to get Fisher friendly again. Fisher didn't hate Stedham enough to turn down the money. Eventually, agents hoped Stedham could then start reminiscing about what happened in the past. Since the FBI gave Fisher a reason to see their informant, the next step was to get Fisher confessing on tape. A few days later, Fisher asked Stedham to meet him at a coffee shop.
Pick it up. Mr. Stedham, here's what I want you to do.
Stedham was nervous about the wire, but finally agreed to wear it.
Let's do it.
Okay, here we go.
He was terrified, and he was worried that Fisher would frisk him. He was worried that Fisher might get suspicious. So basically, what we advised him to do was to just say, look, tell him that the insurance company is calling him and asking him about this. That way, it'll keep him off the trail of thinking that any law enforcement is involved.
Under the watchful eye of agents, Stedham met with Fisher briefly. The murder suspect said little and avoided the incident in Virginia altogether. Fisher had been an informant himself at one time and suspected Stedham was wired. Outside the restaurant, the mood turned ugly. If agents moved in now, Stedham's cover would be blown. But if they didn't, they feared the suspected murderer would kill again if he found the wire. Agents surveilled murder suspect David Fisher, hoping that their wired informant Gerald Stedham would be able to solicit a confession from his old friend. Fisher arranged the meeting to receive money that Stedham owed him. But Fisher was suspicious of Stedham. To the relief of Stedham and agent James Lillard, Fisher never found the wire.
The first time that we had wired Stedham up and sent him in to talk to Fisher, he was a little too zealous. And he was asking too many poignant questions. So Fisher kind of got a little suspicious and actually frisked him. Fortunately, we had the recording device in a place where he wasn't going to find it.
Unless Fisher called to meet Stedham again, Special Agent Robert McDowell and his team had no other means to get the evidence they needed to arrest Fisher for his 2-year-old crime. 5 days later, Fisher called Stedham to arrange another meeting. Agents were hopeful. The cooperating witness tried to steer the conversation towards Fisher's past crimes, but Fisher once again avoided the topic.
It was one of these situations where Fisher constantly would talk about the fact that he didn't trust anybody, didn't want to talk about anything. Every time Stedham would try to bring up the conversation about what happened back in those days, he would be tight-lipped. He wouldn't do it.
Since Fisher said nothing to corroborate Stedham's version of events, it occurred to agents that perhaps Stedham may be lying, since the ex-convict was reluctant to come forward in the first place.
Yes.
The FBI conducted a polygraph examination to evaluate Stedham's credibility.
Yeah.
Stedham admitted he lied about Fisher, offering him $50,000 to kill Mulligan.
Were you hired to kill Bobby Mulligan?
Yes.
He insisted that Fisher had asked him to do it, but he could not remember the exact amount he'd been offered.
But I can't really remember.
Just answer yes or no.
One of the things we did in order to try to make sure we weren't just chasing our tails was to get Stedham a polygraph exam. And the fact that it was non-conclusive could be that there may be some things that he's saying that he's maybe holding back, but in general, what he's stating is pretty much going to be correct.
Agents believe Stedham was still their best hope of getting to Fisher, since the case lacked any physical evidence. But Fisher, the delivery man for the morgues, was extremely cautious, particularly with Stedham. For the case to move forward, the FBI needed another plan.
So what we're going to have to do is create a situation in Fisher's mind where he felt they were closing in on him, one way or another, to try to stir the conversation.
Agents figured that Fisher would relax his suspicion of being taped while inside his own vehicle. On a day that Fisher asked Stedham to help him with a job, agents decided the time was right.
Technology was just starting to come out, where actually voices would come across on a beeper. And Stedham had one. So we had a female in our office make a phone call to Stedham on his beeper, telling him to call home immediately, making believe that the voice that was coming over the pager was Stedham's girlfriend. So the car stopped, Stedham got out.
For appearances, Stedham briefly spoke to the agent back in the office to let her know the message was received. When Stedham returned to the car, he told Fisher that it was an insurance agent asking to meet Stedham about an ongoing investigation. Fisher told him that if he kept his mouth shut, their new inquiry would go nowhere, since the body had been cremated and that everyone said it was an accident.
He says, and I'm telling you right now, if anybody tries to bring up anything, any witnesses pop their head above the water, it's going to be pow, 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 pow. And those are the sounds that came over the tape. And we realized at that point what Fisher was doing was actually threatening the lives of all witnesses involved in the investigation that took place.
The recording was good, but it was far from a confession. Agents had hoped for more. Unfortunately, over the next several weeks, Fisher avoided Stedham altogether. Agents pursued Mulligan instead. On tape, the shooter described a meeting he had with Fisher after the shooting. Mulligan told him that he had written out the details of what happened and gave it to someone for safekeeping. If Fisher killed Mulligan, those details would be mailed to authorities. Mulligan refused to tell Stedham what he had written or who held the letter. Then, just after midnight on June 16, 1986, an anonymous woman called the FBI to report that a hitman would be coming after Stedham. Agents scrambled to hide their informant at a remote location. They suspected that Fisher had made the threat. Investigators hoped they could secure an arrest warrant before the suspected killer got to Stedham. Fisher had arranged a killing before. Agents feared he would kill again. While agents began to close in on murder suspect David Fisher, the FBI received a death threat against their informant, Gerald Stedham. To protect their key witness, Stedham was held in a remote location until agents could decipher the identity of the caller. Two days later, agents reported their discovery to Stedham.
What is it?
The death threat had been traced to the residence of one of Stedham's friends. Stedham admitted that he had a female friend place the call, but he emphasized that the threat was real. He explained that his longtime friend David Fisher was suddenly acting like a stranger. To Stedham, this could only mean one thing. Fisher, the man who transported bodies for the morgues, was planning to kill him. Agents weren't happy with Stedham's deception, but Agent McDowell knew that the danger to Stedham was genuine.
Stedham told me that Fisher, as a part of being dealing with the morticians and all the different funeral homes, had obtained a number of chemicals that he felt that could be injected into people without them ever knowing, and that they would die without any traces of whatsoever of what caused their death.
The only way to assure Stedham's safety was to get Fisher into custody. Before they could do that, they needed more evidence. In the fall of 1986, a year and a half after the FBI began their investigation, agents finally tracked down David Wilkey's former fiancée. They found her in Florida with a new married name.
What we'd like to do is just begin. Just tell me.
She told agents that she and Wilkey were engaged 6 weeks after they met and planned to move to Florida. To save money, the couple moved in with Fisher for a short time. But after her fiancé was killed, she moved out immediately. She told agents that she felt intimidated by Fisher. Just before Wilkey's death, Fisher had come to her with a proposition to kill the boy for insurance money. Like Stedham, she didn't believe Fisher was serious until Wilkey turned up dead.
What we want to do is, he said, it was get him a few drinks and then give him a good time. I want you to lure him into the pool, get him into the deep end, and then I want you to drown him. And because he can't swim. Then, again, they'll call a hotel security, and it'll look like an accident.
There was something strange about him.
She believed Fisher was responsible for the killing, but she had no way to prove it and feared she could be next.
Well, thank you very much. You've been very helpful, and
we were very surprised. So many people were aware that Fisher was looking for somebody to kill Wilkey. That was incredible. We found it hard to believe that he had gone to that many people regarding some type of scam or some type of setup to murder somebody.
Wilkey's former fiancée had provided a few more pieces of corroborating evidence. Though Special Agent McDowell felt the case still had holes, he believed they had to arrest Fisher and Mulligan before someone else was killed.
We were stretching our luck with David Fisher, knowing the type of person he was, to wind up reaching out and finally making up his mind and killing somebody. We decided that it would be best to go after him and seek indictments and get him arrested and take him off the street, as well as Bobby Mulligan.
On November 5th, 1986, a Virginia grand jury handed down an indictment charging Fisher and Mulligan with first-degree murder. But with the evidence they had, a conviction was still questionable. McDowell had one last chance to get the taped confession from Fisher that would guarantee a guilty verdict at trial.
I really wanted to try one more time to get Fisher to articulate in detail the fact that he had killed Wilkey for money, and I really would like to have heard a verbal confession from him. And I felt that the only way we could do that was you had to escalate his anger. You had to get him to the point where he just lost control, and then we'd start being truthful.
On the night of November 12, 1986, 3 years after Wilkey's death, agents wired Stedham after he had baited Fisher with the promise of some easy cash. Stedham had told him that a bail bondsman whom they both knew had a lead on a suspect who had jumped bail. The bondsman, covertly working for the FBI, would ride along.
There were several locations in which the trio would go. And the plan was that the third individual in the car would be able to get out of the car, and leaving Fisher and Stedham alone. And that in between each stop, Stedham would escalate the situation by confronting Fisher straight up.
Everybody who will listen, you sitting there.
Stedham needed to push Fisher to the brink in the hopes that he'd reveal his crime. But if Fisher first discovered that Stedham was an informant, the FBI's key witness might end up dead.
been paid through the police.
The FBI plan to arrest suspected murderer David Fisher had been set in motion, though agents were still uncertain whether they had enough evidence to convict.
Well, I just
Their
think we
last
got a
hope
problem
rested
more
with
than
informant
you.
Gerald
Bobby
Stedham.
just will not be quiet. He keeps talking and talking.
Wearing a wire, Stedham needed to convince Fisher to talk directly about the killing. A bondsman who Fisher believed was checking leads on a fugitive was in fact working covertly for the FBI.
See, you know, it kills me about Mulligan.
When the bondsman left the car, Stedham provoked the suspected killer to react as Agent McDowell had instructed.
Plenty of money. He got overpaid. If anybody lost.
Stedham inside the car had done his job. He really tried to get him cranked up to the point where he would lose control and actually start talking.
See you later.
But Fisher started reverting into that mode of being even more quiet, and we knew at that point that what Fisher was doing was going into his planning mode.
To agents, the risk had become too great. If Fisher discovered Stedham was wired, the key witness, the case, and the arrest would be jeopardized. As planned, at around 11 p.m., Stedham suggested that they report back to the bond office that had supposedly hired them. When they arrived, FBI agents and Charlotte police would be waiting.
Once he got out of the car, he pretty much said to Stedham, in no uncertain terms, I'll see you later. Our units in the area were able to converge in on Fisher and had him pretty much surrounded. He wasn't going to run.
Members of the Charlotte Police Department's fugitive unit arrested Fisher, Stedham, and the other bondsmen. They wanted to remove any suspicion that Stedham and the bondsmen had set Fisher up.
The other part of the plan that night was that we had surveillance teams out following Bobby Mulligan, and we knew where he was going to be located. So after the arrest of Fisher took place, we immediately restaged and set up our arrest phase for Bobby Mulligan.
Agents replaced the tape in the recorder Stedham was wearing. As instructed, Stedham had made arrangements earlier that evening to pick up Mulligan from a club where he worked part-time. It was after midnight when the two of them arrived at a tavern.
Who's gonna drink first? I'll buy.
He persuaded Mulligan to sit at the bar, where they'd be visible to the agents outside in case anything went wrong. When units from the Charlotte Police Department arrived, agents directed them to make the arrest.
Mulligan, you're under arrest. Put your hands on top of
For
your
their
head. Don't
informant's
move.
safety and to encourage Mulligan's cooperation, they arrested both men. Though Mulligan and his former employer, David Fisher, were now in custody, agents still needed one of them to talk about the murder.
We wanted to set it up to the point where David Fisher would be within view of the fact that Bobby Bryce Mulligan was being brought in. And we wanted him to know in no uncertain terms that we had him and we had the shooter, and hopefully to make him realize that he was had.
It didn't work. Fisher declined to be interviewed without an attorney being present. Agents secured a warrant to search the room that Fisher had been renting. Recorded in Fisher's diary, they found a series of cash payments to Mulligan. From a closet, they removed 2 strong boxes. Agents hoped that inside they would find the criminal evidence that could ensure Fisher's conviction. Agents obtained a search warrant and cut the locks.
Okay, our first item.
Inside the first box, they found documents that held David Wilkey's signature.
Manila folder.
folder.
They were likely samples used by Fisher to falsify the insurance claim.
Signed and everything, partner.
But the evidence was only circumstantial.
This definitely is going to tie this in.
In the other, they found only personal effects, nothing of evidentiary value. It looked like agents would have little else to offer as evidence at trial. A few days later, Agent McDowell got a message that 22-year-old Bobby Mulligan wanted to meet. So far, both Mulligan and Fisher had remained quiet.
But after a couple days of thinking about it and in consultation with his parents, it was apparently Mr. Mulligan's decision that he wanted to come clean about his participation in this murder and felt that it was to his best benefit to be the first to come forward with a confession.
Start with,
Agents interviewed Mulligan at an office in the jail. He confirmed that David Wilkey's death was no accident.
When did you first get contacted by Fisher for this contract?
Mulligan said it all began with Fisher's plan to kill Wilkey's fiancée. Fisher had fronted Wilkey money to romance a young woman, kill her, then collect on her insurance.
Hey, David, I just want to say something.
But Wilkey fell in love and backed out.
Try to stay out of the way, okay? Thanks, it won't be that long.
Fisher was furious. To get the money back that he had invested in the teenager, Fisher recruited Mulligan to kill Wilkey for his insurance. Mulligan's story supported Steadham's. Agents finally had the corroborating evidence they'd been pursuing for over a year. Mulligan added that he had tried to call the whole thing off, but Fisher kept pressuring him to shoot Wilkey and get it over with. He said Fisher brought his ex-wife's son along as a decoy. Mulligan maintained that he actually did slip and fall.
I'm fine.
Mulligan claimed that he hadn't intended to kill Wilkey, only injure him. He said it was Fisher who actually murdered the kid.
He believed that it was the finger of David Fisher going into the wound that killed Wilkey, that his own gunshot didn't do it. So he believed that Fisher actually did this. But unfortunately, there was no way of being able to determine that forensically because Fisher convinced Wilkey's mother in a phone call at least 2 days after the incident happened that it was Wilkey's last request to be cremated.
What was the final contract amount?
He said Fisher had promised him $38,000 to pull the trigger, but ended up paying him only $7,000. David Fisher was tried for first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and murder for hire. Fisher got the death penalty. Mulligan pled guilty to the same charges and was sentenced to life in prison.
I had been a law enforcement officer almost 13 years before I became an FBI agent. And the one thing I did realize from this case is that people can be extremely, extremely cold-blooded and evil, and that there is no remorse whatsoever in their souls, none. And that anytime you hear a story about something not being right, you have to listen to it. You have to listen to them and hear what they have to say, because you never know when something like that could be true.
11 years later, on March 25, 1999, David Lee Fisher was executed by lethal injection.
Fisher?
David Wilkey had considered Fisher his closest friend. But to David Lee Fisher, money was more important than friendship, or even life itself. On this day, a corpse would need to be transported, but this time, it would be Fisher's. In Minnesota, a gruesome murder left few clues behind. A local drug boss became a suspect, but he was well insulated against police. FBI agents and local detectives had to infiltrate a dangerous cartel.
Okay, go ahead.
To get to a pair of gangsters who killed with no remorse.
A burning body in a dark alley shed light on a cold-blooded killer. His partners in crime would tell the story if they lived. In the underworld of the drug trade, even a childhood friend can quickly become an enemy. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. A trail of drugs and money led FBI agents to a murderer who underestimated the power of forensic science.
June 24th, 1990. At about 3 a.m., a St. Paul, Minnesota resident was enjoying the quiet of a summer evening when he noticed a car drive into the alley behind his house. Moments later, he heard the distinct sound of a fire erupting, then the car speeding away. Checking the alley, he discovered a large object engulfed in flames. He feared the fire would ignite his property. He called 911. St. Paul emergency units responded. When firemen extinguished the flames, they realized it was more than an act of vandalism. The object was a charred human body wrapped in a melted plastic tarp. Homicide detectives arrived at the scene. They questioned the resident, but he hadn't seen the car or who was in it. Police found no identification on or near the body. Investigators hoped an autopsy would provide more information. If they could identify the victim, it might help lead them to those responsible. A medical examiner determined the victim was a black male in his mid-20s and that he was dead before the fire was set. Cause of death, multiple gunshot wounds to the head. The examiner extracted 3 small-caliber slugs. They would be sent to the ballistics lab for examination. Despite the fire damage, the examiner found powder burns on the victim's head, indicating he had been shot at point-blank range. If enough of his fingerprints remained, they might help identify him. The prints were entered into the automatic fingerprint identification system. AFIS is a national database containing the prints of 23 million persons. The body had probably been burned to make identification difficult. With the AFIS technology, it might be possible. But running the prints would take some time. Police believed such a gruesome murder was probably drug-related. The Minneapolis-St. Paul area had recently become a popular import spot for narcotics. With the drugs came an increase in violent crime. Special Agent John Tyndall of Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension investigated drug running in the area.
The primary way that people
moved cocaine into this state at that time would have been through public transportation, that being either by bus or by airplane.
Police created drug interdiction teams assigned to the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport to try to stop the influx. Agents monitored travel to and from cities like Miami and Los Angeles where the drugs originated. Their job was to spot drug traffickers among legitimate passengers. On June 25, 1990, the day after the body was recovered in the alley, agents were watching the counters where same-day tickets were issued.
These two guys approached the ticket agent and stood there for quite some time doing what we felt was negotiating the sale of some tickets. They pulled out a wad of cash. They paid cash for the tickets. They then left the ticket counter.
The agents would check at the counter and learn that the men were flying under the names Jeffrey English and Harry Babbs. Agents caught up with the men at their gate as they waited to board their flight. They asked if they would answer some questions.
We explained to them that they had no obligation to talk to us if they didn't want to. They weren't under arrest. They were free to leave.
Both men consented to be interviewed and said they were just heading back home to L.A. They said they had come to St. Paul to visit a friend named Ken Jones. The officers asked for permission to search the bags they'd checked at the counter. Both agreed, so a search warrant was unnecessary. The bags hadn't been loaded onto the aircraft yet. Inside the one belonging to Jeffrey English was a plastic bag containing rolls of cash totaling $13,000.
All right. Got it.
Tucked into a shoe was a .22 caliber Derringer pistol. It would have been easy to miss.
It was a tiny revolver, 5-round capacity, with a barrel that was only 1 inch long, and the entire gun was approximately 4 inches long, a gun that could be concealed simply by palming it in your hand.
In the other bag was another handgun. Neither had been declared. That violation, plus the suspicious amount of cash, provided enough probable cause for an arrest.
Officer Moss, we need
The officer radioed his partner.
be aware they could be armed and dangerous.
They had to detain Babbs and English before they took off. The plane was still at the terminal. The agent boarded the plane and found the men already seated.
I just need to ask you a couple questions. It won't take long.
In a later interview, English would claim that the money was from selling a car. He said he bought the .22 Derringer on the street in Minneapolis.
And he went on to add that he had no idea where the gun had been. And I thought that was a strange response for a person to back away from the gun's history. And that was the first inclination that either of us had that the gun might have been used in some type of crime, simply by the way he framed his response to the question.
Agents became more suspicious when English admitted he was flying under a false name. His real name was Jeffrey Barnes. There was no evidence against Barnes or his companion for anything but misdemeanor weapons violations. Both men paid fines and were released. Their guns were held until agents could check police records to see if they'd been used in earlier crimes. 2 weeks later, St. Paul police received the fingerprint comparison from the man found burned in the alley. There was a match from Southern California. The victim's name was Duan Walker. The 26-year-old Los Angeles area resident had a record for intent to sell narcotics. Walker's death made the papers in his hometown. His uncle read the article and called the St. Paul authorities.
Operator.
St. Paul Police, please.
He told detectives his nephew had gone there to meet a man named Ken Jones.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you very much for your information. We appreciate that.
Yes, officer, my name is...
When Walker didn't return from St. Paul, the uncle had contacted Jones, who said Walker had already left.
It's going to be a big help. All right. Bye-bye. I think I have the folder right here.
St. Paul narcotics detectives were familiar with Jones. They had been investigating him for years. He was reputed to be the largest supplier of cocaine in the region. Jones was careful with his drug business and well insulated against investigation.
Thanks, everyone. On behalf of the Neighborhood Development Board, we'd like to give a big round of applause.
By publicly donating to urban charities, Ken Jones also portrayed himself as a community benefactor. Police knew it was a cover. Like his legitimate businesses they believed he used to launder drug money. His reputation was different on the street. Among dealers and addicts, Jones was known to rule his interests with an iron fist. If he didn't get paid, people got hurt.
Hold on, I got your money. I got all your money.
For years, detectives had been searching for a way to shut the drug boss down. Detectives knew that murder victim Duan Walker was with Jones before his death. If they could prove the dealer was involved, they could finally take him off the street. But they needed more evidence. Investigators went to interview employees of Jones's business.
Hi, can I help you?
They hoped someone would know about Jones meeting Duan Walker.
Never seen him before.
Never seen this person at all?
But none of the employees were willing to talk. Drug boss Ken Jones continued his narcotics trafficking. He seemed to be beyond the reach of the law. On June 24, 1990, St. Paul authorities had found the body of 26-year-old Duan Walker burning in an alley. Just before his death, he had met with drug boss Ken Jones. Police believe Jones was involved in the murder. But witnesses wouldn't talk, and no physical evidence implicated him. Investigators got an unexpected break 3 months later when St. Paul police stopped a man for a routine traffic violation. A computer check revealed there was a warrant out for the arrest of Charles Shuck.
Yes, sir. We have an arrest warrant for you, sir. Put your hands on the car, sir.
Police took him into custody. They contacted the investigator who had issued the warrant, Special Agent John Tyndall of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
Yes, sir. We'll get it straightened out. We got your wrong guy.
The arrest warrant was issued for Charles Shuck for importing 2 kilos of cocaine. We attempted to find him at the address that he had given, and he wasn't there, and we had no way of knowing where he was at that time.
Several months earlier, a drug interdiction team at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport had spotted the courier. They watched Chuck pay cash for a full-fare, last-minute ticket to Los Angeles.
That would be one way round trip.
Round trip.
Chuck didn't check a bag and carried only one onto the plane.
Boarding pass here.
The next day, agents saw him return, now with 2 bags. They knew couriers often had extra bags when returning from a drug pickup.
How you doing, sir? I'm Officer Moss. Officer Kendall.
They told Shuck that they could not arrest him, but they could hold his luggage for inspection. Authorities could not open his bags without his consent, and he did not give it.
You're not hiding anything, are you?
Shuck's response was not that of innocent travelers.
If you tell them that you're going to detain their bags, typically, if they have nothing to hide, they want to stay with their bags. They don't want to leave those bags behind. Shuck had none of that. He had no questions. He had no concerns. His primary concern was getting out of there just as fast as he could.
Take a look at this on my shoulders.
Shortly after Shuck left, a canine unit examined the bags. One was clean, but in the other, the dog smelled narcotics.
You can't get a search warrant based strictly on the actions of the dog. The dog was an integral part of it in the request for the search warrant, but it wasn't the only part. We also had to detail the fact that we had seen Shuck the previous night come in and buy a high-dollar round-trip ticket to Los Angeles, with a return flight being the following morning. These things are unusual. The fact that he carried one small bag on the aircraft and carried two off is also unusual.
Agents secured a search warrant to open the bags. Inside, they recovered 2 kilos of cocaine. Investigators suspected Shuck was carrying the drugs for someone else.
At that time, we weren't able to make a connection as to who he might be working with or working for, but my gut feeling was that he was a courier for somebody at a higher level.
Now that he had been arrested, Shuck learned of the evidence against him. He had his attorney propose a deal. In exchange for sentencing consideration, he would give up information on the man he ran drugs for. More importantly, he would also provide details about the unsolved murder of Duane Walker. Shuck said that the man who employed him as a courier was the same man who had ordered the murder. The man's name was Ken Jones. For every kilo of cocaine delivered, Ken Jones would pay Shuck $1,000. Shuck had worked for the drug boss since high school. It was precisely because their relationship was so strong that Jones did not retaliate for the lost cocaine. But Shuck was not the only courier. Jones' girlfriend also played a major role in the trafficking organization.
Charles Shuck told me that she was intimately familiar with his drug dealing operation. In fact, she had been a stewardess for an airline for a lot of years and had acted as a courier for him, bringing in kilos when she was working as a stewardess.
Investigators asked Shuck if the girlfriend knew about the murder.
Basically, I was a courier.
He said that around the time Walker was killed, she had been very upset.
It was not mine, it was Ken Jones. Irene, are you okay?
She told him that Jones had ordered her to clean up the bathroom of his condo.
What's going on?
There was a great deal of blood by the bathtub.
By the way,
Shuck had heard Walker had been shot there.
You took it from the guy at the airport.
He said the killer's name was Jeffrey Barnes, an enforcer for Jones, and the same man whose suitcase held $13,000 in cash and a .22 Derringer pistol.
He felt that Barnes had shot the victim, Duane Walker, in the head, and that left town the following day after being paid by Ken Jones for that hit. Shuck alleged that the $13,000 cash that was found in the suitcase was at least part of the hit money that was paid to Barnes by Jones for doing the hit, and that the .22 caliber revolver that was found was the murder weapon.
Just know that it wasn't my cocaine. I was just
Shuck knew the caliber of the murder weapon and other details of the crime that hadn't been made public.
So we felt that there was some credibility on Chuck's part that Barnes and Jones could be considered as legitimate suspects in the murder of Walker.
Agents realized they might have the murder weapon already in custody.
Let's see what we got here.
If they could prove it was the gun that killed Duane Walker, they could move forward with the murder case on drug boss Ken Jones and his enforcer Jeffrey Barnes.
Let's take it.
They retrieved the .22 caliber Derringer from the evidence locker. Investigators sent the Derringer to the St. Paul Ballistics Lab for testing. Examiners compared grooved striations inside its barrel to the grooves on the slugs removed from the victim. But their report was disappointing.
The results were inconclusive, in part due to the fact that it only had a 1-inch barrel, and the opportunity to pick up striations from the lands and grooves within this barrel were limited. The longer the barrel, the better the opportunity to pick up the striations. A short barrel like this gives you very limited opportunity.
Without a forensic examination matching Barnes's gun to the bullets that killed Walker, authorities had only the word of a drug smuggler to bring to trial. Agents shipped the gun to the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Lab in Washington, D.C.
The feeling was that their laboratory was somewhat more sophisticated. They were accustomed to doing things like that on a routine basis, and with their sophisticated equipment, they might be able to come up with a determination that was more specific. After it was examined by ATF, they came to the conclusion that it was, in fact, the weapon that was used to murder Duane Walker.
Investigators now knew that enforcer Jeffrey Barnes was in possession of the murder weapon the day after Walker was killed. But they still had no proof that he had fired the fatal shots, or that Ken Jones had ordered the hit.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Agents and detectives sought witnesses who could connect the two men to the homicide.
Could you take a look at the picture?
Whether due to loyalty or fear, authorities were met with silence.
One after the other, the people we attempted to talk to would not talk to us, and they would not give up anything. So we were back to the point of having only the statement given to us by Charles Schuck and no palpable way of corroborating any of the information that he gave us through other witnesses.
Tim, got a minute? Yeah, come on.
Investigators applied for a warrant to search Jones's condominium. But the judge refused to grant one because they couldn't corroborate the story of the blood on the floor.
Information from the pen registers all supports it.
After almost a year, investigators realized that the case would not be solved without additional resources. They contacted the St. Paul FBI's Drug Task Force for assistance. Having worked narcotics for 20 years, Sergeant Tom Donaski was well aware of the reputations of Ken Jones and Jeffrey Barnes.
Both of them were very intimidating and imposing individuals. They had a violent background, and when we'd go and interview people, everyone would pretty much try to avoid either having contact with us or they wouldn't tell us the straight story.
The task force believed that the only way to get to the drug boss and his enforcer would be through a cooperating witness. They needed to find someone who could give them first-hand information and perhaps solicit a taped confession.
He's a chump, man. I ain't afraid of him. I got people on the street.
The investigator approached a confidential informant he had developed on earlier cases.
But if you do something, I can have him.
The informant couldn't place Barnes with the victim,
He got a bad reputation. I'll take him down.
but he did know that the enforcer had a nephew who had recently been released from prison.
What's up, man? What's up, Clay? What's up, dude?
The nephew's name was Russell Barnes, known on the street as Ice.
Yeah, they moving folk
After leaving prison, he had come to St. Paul to begin dealing cocaine with contacts provided by his uncle, Jeffrey Barnes. The nephew was anxious to make money. Agents hoped to use his eagerness to their advantage. Investigators developed a new strategy in the fall of 1992. The enforcer's nephew would become their new target. FBI Special Agent Grant Beasy, a specialist in wire intercepts, was called in as part of the plan.
We went after Russell, number one, because he was a pretty good-sized dope dealer. And number two, he dealt with his uncle, Jeffrey, and we felt that if we could get a case made against Russell, that would help us make a case against Jeffrey.
To get him, agents would somehow have to infiltrate the closed ranks of a dangerous drug underworld. In 1992, investigators believed a St. Paul drug boss and his enforcer had killed Duane Walker. They had already recovered the murder weapon. But Sergeant Tom Donaski, assigned to an FBI drug task force, needed corroborating evidence in order to arrest drug boss Ken Jones and his enforcer Jeffrey Barnes.
Just having the weapon alone wasn't enough to get him prosecuted for it. We felt that we're going to have to identify some people or bring some people into court that'll be able to testify that Jeff Barnes and Ken Jones were involved, in the murder.
FBI Special Agent Grant Beasy believed that if they first arrested the enforcer's nephew, drug dealer Russell Barnes, he might provide the information they needed.
We had sources of information that were close to Russell that gave us the indication that he knew that his uncle had committed the murder. We didn't know to what extent that Russell knew about it.
To build a narcotics case against Russell Barnes, the FBI enlisted a trusted informant with credibility on the street.
And I can hear what I'm saying coming back through here. All right.
Agents wired the informant, who would engage in controlled drug buys with the enforcer's nephew. Task force members would record each buy. It was a risky operation. If the informant's wire was discovered, he would likely be killed. Agents wanted to build trust and avoid any possibility that Russell Barnes might suspect it was a setup.
What's up, Ice? Hey, bro. Chillin', chillin'. What you need? What you want? Okay, all right. You want taste?
At first, the informant bought small amounts. Over time, the transactions increased in size and frequency, and each was recorded.
Bags like this, right over top. That's a nice package. Everything's everything.
But Russell Barnes refused to speak about his knowledge of the murder.
Later.
Agents were no closer to solving the crime. The FBI needed to plant someone closer to the enforcer himself.
They did.
In May of 1993, they discovered their way in. An informant working for the St. Paul FBI on another case mentioned that he and Jeffrey Barnes had done time together. He claimed they were very close and that Barnes trusted him. He said he was sure he could get Barnes to sell him cocaine and to talk about the Duane Walker murder.
So, you know Barnes really well.
Agents tested the informant's credibility by having him call the enforcer. Within moments, it became clear Jeffrey Barnes was comfortable talking to the informant.
No, I've been out a couple of months now.
I'm still in the business. You know me.
It was the break investigators were looking for. Now they needed to find a place for the drug buys, a controlled environment that could be adequately wired.
I've been eating well.
At the time, the informant was living with a relative and couldn't really do things at his home. We obtained a house from HUD and moved the informant into the house. And the informant agreed to record certain conversations that he might have with Jeffrey Barnes.
Investigators set the informant up in a government-owned house on the west side of St. Paul. He was to contact the FBI anytime the enforcer was planning to visit the house for a drug deal. FBI technicians wired the house with electronic listening devices in 3 rooms. Agents knew Barnes liked to boast about being a hitman, referring to himself as Murder Incorporated.
With that information, we tried to encourage the informant to try to bring him to a point where he would talk to him about, you know, acts of violence that he was involved in and things like that. And this is something that Jeff Barnes' reputation was all about, and it's something that he liked to brag about.
Agents coached their informant on how to draw Barnes out about the murder of Duane Walker.
Thank you, thank you.
He was to lead the enforcer into talking about the hits he had performed in the past.
Well, look, I don't want to take too much of your time.
In one tape conversation, the informant pretended he wanted Barnes to help him rob a drug dealer.
Let me go up there and rough him up a little bit.
Jeffrey Barnes suggested that they just kill him.
Murder?
Been a hitman a long time.
Barnes told the informant that doing a hit on somebody is not a problem, and he described how he could do it. He would walk up behind the individual, pop him in the head with a handgun, let him fall on the floor, wrap him in plastic, and drag his body outside and put it in an alley. And this was the exact same way that Duane Walker had been killed.
Don't want to take up too much of your time. Let's say we get down to business. Don't stay in business long.
It was good circumstantial evidence, but by itself, it wasn't enough.
Okay. I got your money.
Because the buys had been arranged by telephone, investigators secured a warrant to tap the suspect's phone lines. Although the wire intercepts captured no information on the Walker murder, they did produce details of the drug operation. In January 1994, the task force decided it was time to arrest Russell Barnes and hope he would turn on his uncle. On January 29th, they set up another controlled drug buy with an informant. It would happen at a downtown St. Paul hotel. Investigators wired the room for sound.
You can go. Okay.
The reliability of the eavesdropping devices was essential.
Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2.
The recordings would be used in court. And agents would be monitoring from an adjacent room. If Russell Barnes discovered the setup, they would be able to protect their informant.
Okay, go ahead and give me a signal.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
When the room was ready, they would have the informant call the enforcer's nephew and order several ounces of cocaine.
Mary had a little lamb. Testing, 1. Mary had a little lamb. Mary
Investigators from St. Paul Police Special Investigations Unit were conducting the surveillance at Russell Barnes' residence, and after the phone calls were made, with very short delay, Russell went to the hotel.
Russell Barnes had delivered to the informant before.
Glad to see you came around, boy. I told you one day we'd be rolling like this. See what you need tonight.
He brought cocaine and the equipment he needed for measuring it.
You came correct. Well, I knew what I had to do.
He suspected nothing.
Big times, big times.
To him, it was just another deal.
2 keys.
He set up shop and began the transaction, unaware that every word was being recorded. It was important to get a drug dealer off the streets. But what agents really wanted was for Russell Barnes to give a statement about drug boss Ken Jones and enforcer Jeffrey Barnes committing murder.
You ready?
When details of the drug deal were on tape, investigators moved in.
Put your hands behind your head. Okay, we're clear.
They had indisputable evidence of Russell Barnes selling roughly 2 ounces of cocaine.
On your knees.
Investigators explained to him that as a 3-time narcotics offender, Russell was looking at a minimum of 15 years in prison. They wanted a statement about his uncle.
Right, Barnes. You know
We sat him down and we talked at some length about Jeffrey Barnes and his involvement with the Dwan Walker homicide. Being somewhat reluctant because this was his uncle, it took some persuasion, and after a while we gained his confidence, and he eventually told us his knowledge about the Dwan Walker homicide.
What happened with Walker? Walker.
Jeffrey Barnes had told him Walker tried to steal cocaine from Ken Jones.
Took my gun, I put it to his
So they
head.
killed him.
Pow!
The enforcer said they then dumped Walker's body in an alley, doused it with gasoline, and lit it afire.
Nobody messes with my money.
It was, at best, a second-hand confession.
Nobody messes with my drug operation. And
Russell
also
Barnes was taken into
murder that
custody.
boy, Dwan Walker.
All right, let's go. Stand up.
Agents also arrested their informant, so no one would know he cooperated.
Discovered a 22 caliber. Sounds like the one I'm working on. Record.
Drug boss Ken Jones was still on the street, as was his enforcer, Jeffrey Barnes.
Just pop him.
But the FBI task force was closing in.
Nothing to it.
By 1994, while trying to dismantle a Minnesota drug ring and solve a 4-year-old murder, the FBI and St. Paul police had arrested dealer Russell Barnes, who agreed to cooperate. He offered details on the crimes committed by his uncle Jeffrey Barnes, including nationwide drug trafficking and the 1990 murder of Dwan Walker. According to Sergeant Tom Donaski, investigators had plenty of evidence against Jeffrey Barnes, a known enforcer for drug boss Ken Jones.
We've got a weapon that's been recovered at the airport. We've got Jeff Barnes making a comment to one of our informants that this is how you murder somebody. That's a dope ripoff type of situation. And the actual procedure that he went through when he killed Dwan Walker, and now we have his nephew telling us that he's been at his house, blood relative, that we're going to have testify in court that he actually told him about the murder.
In August 1994, investigators staked out the apartment where Jeffrey Barnes was staying. They knew the enforcer was often armed and willing to kill. He had no time to react.
Freeze! Please help! Put your hands up on the car. Come on, move! Move! Put your hands
Prosecutors did not yet charge him with murder.
Got it?
They went forward with a drug conspiracy case instead.
You have your other hand.
Dealing drugs to his ex-cellmate earned Barnes 30 years in prison. They would hold the murder case until they had more evidence against him and Ken Jones. Special Agent Grant Beasy believed having Barnes in prison would make witnesses more willing to talk.
Jeff Barnes had the reputation of being an enforcer. He scared people. We felt that getting him off the street would take away the intimidation factor against some of these other people. And it would be better for us to be able to talk to these other folks with him being locked up.
The plan worked. After Barnes's arrest, investigators met with an associate of Ken Jones. Facing a long prison term on drug charges, he offered to be a government witness. He said he had extensive knowledge about Jones's drug cartel and that he had met Duane Walker just before his murder. In mid-June 1990, Jones had ordered the cooperating witness to drive a pickup truck to St. Louis, where he was to meet Walker. The truck had been fitted with a second fuel tank. Upon arrival in St. Louis, Duane Walker stuffed several bags of cocaine into the false tank. When full, the tank held about 30 kilos of the drug. That amount of cocaine would have been worth more than $1 million. The cooperating witness then drove the truck back to St. Paul, where he turned it over to the drug boss. Walker had arrived earlier and was staying with Jones at his condominium. Jones hadn't paid Walker for the drugs yet. In fact, he and his enforcer decided not to.
The two of them conspire to take the dope and to eliminate the problem and just execute Duane Walker.
That's Bo.
The witness's testimony would explain the motive for the killing. He told the agents that several days later he got a call from the drug boss. He was ordered to come over to the condo immediately. It was Sunday morning, June 24th, 1990, the day following Duane Walker's murder. Ken Jones seemed very nervous. He ordered the cooperating witness to get rid of the truck he had driven up from St. Louis, the one with the false gas tank. The drug boss demanded that no one be told about the cocaine run. The witness said Jones's girlfriend had also told him about cleaning up blood in the bathroom after the murder.
This picture, you recognize this chick? Do you swear to tell the truth?
In the summer of 1995, prosecutors convened a grand jury to secure witness testimony under oath. Jones's girlfriend was subpoenaed to testify.
That would be Irene, the sister of Charles.
But she denied telling anyone that she cleaned up blood in Jones's
I'm not sure what
bathroom.
you're talking about. I never cleaned up any blood.
The Ken Jones.
If authorities couldn't prove she was lying, they might never be able to indict Ken Jones and Jeffrey Barnes for murder.
No, sir.
What if you would tell us, please, about the evening...
In June 1995, grand jury testimony from others proved that one witness perjured herself when she denied cleaning up blood in the bathroom of drug boss Ken Jones.
Ken Jones, did you not?
I'm not sure what you're talking about, sir.
On June 21st, the grand jury indicted Jones and his main enforcer Jeffrey Barnes for the 1990 murder of Duane Walker. Barnes, the alleged hitman, was already in prison on drug charges. The day after the indictment, investigators staked out the home of drug boss Ken Jones. Although he had insulated himself well against the investigation, Ken Jones was finally arrested for murder.
Cover.
FBI Drug Task Force member Sergeant Tom Danaski was determined to find physical evidence to back up witness testimony at the trial.
Through the investigation, everything focused on the fact that Dewan Walker was murdered in the bathroom, and he was shot in the head there. I was thinking that we might be able to still find a trace of blood in the grouting on the floor in the bathroom.
Bureau of Criminal Apprehension technicians processed the bathroom. After Jones was arrested, new tenants had moved into the condo.
Hit the lights. Ready?
They gave their consent for the search. The technicians tested for the presence of blood using luminol, a relatively new technique at the time. Luminol reacts with proteins in blood, rendering minute traces of it visible under ultraviolet light.
We were able to determine on the underlayment underneath the tile that there was a significant amount of blood. They were unable to obtain a DNA off that test, but they were able to obtain a test that showed that it was a significant amount of blood, and it was human blood that was still traceable back even 5 years.
Mr. Barnes and Mr. Jones.
It was the evidence investigators needed.
Are, in fact, the head of
On October 31st, 1995, Ken Jones and Jeffrey Barnes went to trial in St. Paul.
Every year, but also for the murder of Dewan.
Prosecutors outlined what they believed occurred in Dewan Walker's final
These two
hours.
gentlemen here are responsible for all of this.
Walker had delivered roughly 30 kilos of cocaine to Jones. The drug boss decided he didn't want to pay. That night, he and his main enforcer, Jeffrey Barnes, partied with Walker. Eventually, Walker headed into the bathroom. Jones and Barnes had planned the hit to take place there. Dewan Walker was unarmed. Barnes fired 3 shots from his .22 caliber Derringer. As always, Jones maintained his distance. Walker died immediately. Later that night, they wrapped Walker's body in plastic sheets to contain the blood and loaded it into a car. They drove to an alley and dumped the body. To make identification more difficult, they doused the body with gasoline and set it ablaze. Jones used his girlfriend to cover his tracks after the murder. The bathroom floor was covered with blood, particularly the area around the tub where Walker had fallen. She was able to clean the surface, but blood had seeped down into the subflooring. 5 years later, technicians would find it there.
You will come away with the inescapable conclusion.
Ken Jones and Jeffrey Barnes were convicted of murder and drug charges.
Responsible for this murder. There has been
In
no
March
evidence
1996, they were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of
the
parole.
associations of these gentlemen through the years.
Jeffrey Barnes, who had once boasted he was Murder Incorporated, was no longer a threat to those outside the prison system. Ken Jones had tried to create an image of himself as a community leader. But his greed led to murder, and he will never leave prison alive. In New York in the 1980s, the emergence of crack cocaine brought a new wave of violence. Drug dealers robbed and killed as they scrambled for power. Ordinary citizens were victimized. Even children were not immune. The FBI joined forces with the New York City police to take back the streets. Their best weapon against deadly drug gangs was the C-11 squad.
New York City is no stranger to gang violence. But when a 12-year-old child was kidnapped, the gangs had crossed the line. Law enforcement raced to find the missing boy before it was too late. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents would have to infiltrate the secretive world of a vicious gang to stop the murderous exploits of a drug lord.
In the 1980s, crack cocaine invaded the Harlem section of New York, as it did many urban areas in America. Over time, the cheap and highly addictive drug crippled communities unlike any other drug had before. With the crack came ruthlessly violent gangs that ruled the streets. No one was truly safe. On December 5th, 1989, 12-year-old Donnell Porter was walking to elementary school alone. He never made it to class that day. When he didn't arrive home after school, his family worried. They hadn't been able to find him in the neighborhood. At 9 p.m., Donnell's sister received a phone call.
Yeah.
A man on the other end said Donnell had been kidnapped. He wanted $500,000 or the boy would be killed.
Inside the men's bathroom.
The sister said the family didn't have that kind of money. It didn't matter to the caller.
Yeah.
He warned them not to contact police, then instructed them to go to a restaurant at 125th and Broadway. Behind a trash can in the restroom, they'd find something that would prove he was serious.
You got it?
A family friend went to the restaurant so the Porters could stay by the phone. He didn't know if it was a setup. Following the kidnapper's orders, he checked behind the trash container and found a coffee can. Inside were 2 rings, an audio cassette, and a child's severed finger. Donnell was hurt and could be bleeding to death. Despite being warned not to, the family called the New York City police.
Following you, looking at you. Nobody standing around.
The family told investigators what they knew. Detectives inspected the evidence. The sister said that the rings belonged to Donnell. They'd been given to the boy by his older brother. On the tape, a recorded plea for help was definitely Donnell's voice. The family told detectives about a second call in which the kidnapper had lowered his ransom to $350,000. It was still far beyond their means. They said they didn't know why they were targeted for such a high ransom. But detectives knew what the family wouldn't say. The victim's older brother, Richard Porter, was a major crack cocaine dealer in the area. Police believe the kidnapping was related to his drug empire. NYPD contacted the New York FBI's reactive squad for assistance. Special Agent David Higgins, a narcotics expert, was asked to provide more intelligence on Richard Porter.
Anything they have, any of them.
Richard Porter, then about 25 years of age, was a well-known crack dealer whose activities took place in central Harlem. He was one of those individuals who got in early on the crack trade in New York, and he had created a significant drug empire in central Harlem.
Richard Porter had made millions of dollars selling crack on New York's streets. Detectives knew where his turf was.
What's going on, man?
It didn't take long to find Porter. Detectives recognized the person he was with as his drug-running partner, Alpo Martinez. This visit wasn't about drugs. It was about finding Donnell. Porter agreed to come to the station for an interview, though he said he didn't know how he could help.
Look, guys, I don't know anything.
Police knew Porter was very close to Donnell, but he claimed to know nothing about who was behind his brother's kidnapping. On the streets, these matters are usually solved without the cops. Though Porter most likely held the key to finding Donnell, he was in no position to talk to authorities.
Richard Porter, because of his situation as a drug trafficker, found himself in a ticklish situation legally. It would have been difficult for him to cooperate directly with law enforcement. I believe he attempted to handle this situation on his own to some extent.
Police had nothing to hold him on. Authorities needed to find someone else to help them. They canvassed the area, trying to gather information on the kidnapping. In such a close-knit neighborhood, someone had to have heard something about Donnell. But residents were too afraid to talk. Harlem's violent gangs had a stranglehold on the community. Detectives were left with nothing. With each passing day, police in NYPD's 32nd precinct knew Donnell's chance of survival decreased. Investigators maintained contact with the boy's family, who were desperate for more word from the kidnappers.
We need to get to the bottom of this.
A week after the abduction, the family received a note. In it, the kidnappers hinted Donnell was still alive. They demanded their money. But no more ransom calls came. With no clues to the boy's whereabouts and no one talking, police had reached a dead end. They somehow needed to pressure Richard Porter into cooperating, or hope he would pay the ransom to get Donnell back. Then, on January 4th, 1990, a month after Donnell's abduction, the body of his brother, drug kingpin Richard Porter, was found in a Bronx park. He had been shot twice, in the head and chest. There would be no one to pay the ransom now.
It was widely assumed that Richard's death was connected to the kidnapping and probably the result of a ransom payment gone bad. However, it was noted early on that when his body was discovered, his wallet contained over $2,000 in U.S. currency. His jewelry was there. Apparently his automobile was nearby. So there was some question about what the actual motivations were behind his murder.
Little boy's missing fingers.
With Richard Porter's death, investigators lost their closest connection to the abducted 12-year-old. To find another source, they increased pressure on lower-level dealers in Porter's organization. Facing drug charges, they were offered leniency in exchange for information. Some said Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, could be involved. Others claimed an infamous Harlem gang called the Preacher Crew might be. But none offered direct leads to the crime. 3 weeks later, a boy's body was recovered in the same Bronx park where Richard Porter was found. His family identified the body of Donnell Porter. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head.
Death of a child is always a disturbing event. There's a 12-year-old boy, he's on the way to public school. He's kidnapped, tortured. He's heard on the tape cassette crying for help from his family.
Donnell's murder stunned the entire Harlem community, even though violence was a daily occurrence there. At the time, Sergeant James Marr worked NYPD's notorious 32nd Precinct, where Donnell lived.
In the late 80s and the early 90s, the 32nd Precinct, which is actually geographically only 1 square mile, was one of the most violent precincts in New York City. They averaged in the area of the upper 60s to low 70s of homicides a year, and added on to that were shootings, several hundred shootings, that the people didn't die.
In response to the increased violence in the city, a task force called the C-11 Squad had been formed at the FBI's New York field office. Detectives from the 32nd Precinct and FBI agents were assigned to the squad.
C-11 was created to address these entrenched criminal conspiracy groups in the city of New York. The locals brought their knowledge of the streets, the knowledge of the subjects involved to the table. The federal agents brought along with them the access to the federal courts, which included the access to the federal sentencing guidelines in the United States Attorney's Office.
After the murder of Donnell Porter, they knew they had to take back the streets. C-11 would first go after Alpo Martinez, Richard Porter's partner.
The problem is here, we haven't
If their partnership had unraveled, he would have had the most to gain from extorting Richard Porter and killing him.
We're still working on some surveillance.
A year earlier, a warrant had been sworn out for his arrest on drug charges. But when Martinez couldn't be found, federal prosecutors had to drop the warrant. In police computers, the C-11 squad flagged the names of known associates of Alpo Martinez. If any were arrested, they would be notified. Months later, police in Washington, D.C. pulled over a car after observing its driver engage in a drug deal. The driver was a known courier for Alpo Martinez. Police found a large amount of crack and thousands of dollars in his car. Noting the flag on his record from New York, D.C. authorities would contact the C-11 squad. After the courier was sentenced to 20 years to life on drug charges, C-11 agents had him transported to New York for an interview.
I want some information because we want...
An agent explained that under federal law, his sentence could be reviewed if he cooperated with authorities.
You're just making this difficult on yourself. Where does he... All I know...
He told what he knew about Martinez and Porter's East Coast drug operation.
Drugs would be distributed both in New York City by Richard Porter and in Washington, D.C. by Alpo Martinez. While in Washington, D.C., Martinez allied himself with individuals that he found to be strong on the street, if you will, in order to protect his drug operation in Washington, D.C. And it was not unusual for literally sea bags worth of U.S. currency to be shipped out of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. up into the Porter neighborhood at 132nd and 7th Avenue in New York City.
It was enough for a renewed arrest warrant on Alpo Martinez. Agents canvassed the neighborhood, talking to people who knew Martinez. Most were afraid to talk. Eventually, agents learned the fugitive was going to pick up his wife's car at a dealership in northern New Jersey. Undercover agents staked out the dealership. They didn't know if Martinez would show up, but they knew he liked fast cars. That afternoon, a sports car pulled up. They watched a passenger get out, but it wasn't Martinez. Agents couldn't tell if the fugitive was driving. They had to risk a closer look. If they could arrest Martinez, it might help solve the murders of Richard Porter and his 12-year-old brother, Donnell. An agent visually identified Martinez as the driver. He radioed a go-ahead signal. But before the arrest team could respond, Martinez spun away. Agents gave chase, but the fugitive disappeared into heavy traffic. With Alpo Martinez still a fugitive, the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter remained unsolved. The abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter showed that Harlem's drug violence was out of control. The FBI's C-11 squad knew the murder was connected to the boy's brother, crack dealer Richard Porter. But Porter himself had been killed. C-11 believed finding Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, would provide answers. But in 1991, Martinez had eluded an FBI undercover operation. From the incident, the FBI got his license plate number and alerted New York police to be on the lookout for the vehicle. The next day, police spotted it, parked on a Harlem street. They impounded it, hoping it might lead to Martinez. They believed the fugitive wouldn't retrieve the vehicle himself, but FBI Special Agent David Higgins waited to see if he'd send someone.
A young lady showed up who claimed to be the true owner. She was the registered owner. Ultimately, a quick investigation established that she was what we call a straw man, or somebody who had stepped forward in order to buy and register the car on behalf of Mr. Martinez.
Martinez was nowhere to be found in New York. Acting on a tip that he had traveled to Washington, D.C., agents set up surveillance at the D.C. home of the fugitive's ex-wife. In the early hours of November 7th, 1991, they spotted Martinez getting into his ex-wife's vehicle. This time, he wasn't driving. As they pulled out, the FBI made their move. The fugitive's ex-wife pulled over. The cocaine in his possession helped cement the case against one of the biggest drug traffickers on the East Coast.
Ultimately, Mr. Martinez pled guilty to an indictment in the Eastern District of Virginia, which accused him of trafficking in over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine. The wholesale value of that would be $20 million.
Investigators also had evidence against Martinez on several gangland murders. They told him they knew he was Richard Porter's partner, so he stood to gain from Donnell's and Richard's death. Hoping to avoid the death penalty, Alpo Martinez agreed to cooperate. He admitted killing his partner, Richard Porter.
Just like we always do on the weekend or
Martinez had begun to suspect his partner had been cheating him out of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So then from there,
He said that more than a year earlier, on January 4th, 1990, he and an associate had taken Richard Porter for a ride. Almost immediately, Martinez and the associate each shot him. They dumped his body in the Bronx Park, where it was found the next day.
talking about it, kill that kid. I don't know.
Martinez swore it was just about missing drug money.
Yo, I didn't kill no
It had nothing to do with Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. No evidence or testimony linked Martinez to that crime. He went to prison for life. Although they had put away a major drug dealer, the local and federal investigators of the C-11 squad were no closer to solving the murder of Donnell Porter. They reviewed FBI intelligence already gathered on other Harlem gangsters who might have profited from extorting and killing Richard Porter.
Porter's known as Richie Rich. We've got a couple of characters.
One gang stood out as likely suspects. They were known as the Preacher Crew. The gang's leader was Clarence Preacher Heatley. FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh, formerly of the C-11 squad, knew the Preacher and his crew were well entrenched and very dangerous.
Preacher Crew was the established crew in the neighborhood, for a long time. Preacher had been kicking around the streets of Harlem since the early 70s, and everybody knew him by his nickname, the Black Hand of Death, and everybody was definitely afraid of him.
NYPD Sergeant James Marr of the C-11 squad learned the Preacher had a reputation for violence. But the gangster was an elusive figure in Harlem.
You could walk up to anybody in the 32nd precinct, no matter how church-going they are, no matter whether they're businessmen or local drug dealers, they all have a Preacher story. They all know who Preacher is. Ask any of them to describe Preacher to you, or a majority of them, they're not going to be able to. Because this guy was an infamous legend in Harlem.
The players in Harlem's drug underworld had carved up the area into zones. Each block, each alley was the established turf of a single dealer. Most dealers respected the boundaries. But the Preacher did not. He considered all of Harlem his turf. He made his money not by dealing drugs, but by taxing other dealers.
But he was mostly into extortion, extorting drug dealers. These are guys that were violent in their own right. He would go up and claim their car. If a drug dealer looked like he was getting paid, so to say, he was driving a brand new full-size Mercedes-Benz, and Preacher liked that car, that was Preacher's.
Those who argued with Preacher paid a heavy price. It was a system that made him a rich man.
If you're hitting every other drug dealer on the streets, 2,000 here, 3,000 here, 5,000 there, that's a lot of money. It adds up. And believe me, they all paid, because if they didn't pay, Preacher would pay him a visit, or he would order his people to pay him a visit, and they'd wind up dead.
The Preacher's history of extortion and violence made him a likely suspect in the abduction and murder of Donnell Porter. C-11 had outlined the basic structure of the Preacher crew.
Including some of his other main guys in his crew.
The Preacher's main lieutenant was a man named John Cuff. He was a particularly dangerous criminal, according to C-11's detective Vinnie Flynn.
John Cuff was an ex-New York City housing cop. As a cop, he provided protection and bodyguard work for Preacher. So if they were driving through the neighborhood and were stopped, John Cuff had a shield where he would probably be let go and not given a summons or anything further would happen. John Cuff had a reputation of one to be feared, very violent person.
Yet no evidence linked either man to Donnell Porter. Though C11 suspected Preacher was involved in the deadly kidnapping, he probably didn't commit it himself. He distanced himself from most of the crimes, having his main lieutenant and other henchmen carry out his orders.
I know you got so much. I know you got so much, man.
At Preacher's command, their brutal extortion tactics earned them money and kept witnesses too intimidated to talk, effectively insulating the crew against investigation.
We go into a bodega or someplace up in Holland, and we'd say, we know he came in here, and the guy would have a cast on his hand. We know he broke your hand, and the shop owner would say, I don't know what you're talking about, and that shop owner would be paying rent, or tax to Preacher, but nobody would tell us anything.
With people too afraid to talk, crimes continued to pile up. On New Year's Eve, 1992, emergency units responded to a call in the Preacher's territory. A man lay dead in his car, the victim of a drive-by shooting. His family survived the harrowing ordeal. They described how the killers pulled up next to them on the street and opened fire. They claimed they didn't know who did it or why. And like Donnell's kidnapping, no one in the neighborhood admitted seeing anything. It was another tragic killing in Harlem that might go unsolved. The C11 squad had to breach the area's violently enforced code of silence and finally get insiders to talk. A shocking drive-by shooting was added to the list of unsolved murders in Harlem. With witnesses too afraid to cooperate with police, the case was open for 2 years. Then in 1994, the C11 squad found a witness who told them the shooter was a Preacher crew member named Malik. Detective Vinnie Flynn learned that Malik had a violent reputation.
He became a so-called director of security for the Preacher organization. He was in charge of the group of members who were known as the janitors. The janitors were the people that had to clean up the problems or the mess of the family. And you couldn't be a janitor unless you killed somebody.
To get more on Malik and the Preacher crew, C11 tried to send in undercover officers. It was yet another dead end, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
We weren't able to really get in, so to speak, and get an undercover in there to buy narcotics from Preacher, because Preacher was very, very careful. He was, he's a very smart man, and we couldn't get the undercover, close to him.
The Preacher had closed ranks, ordering the people he extorted not to sell to new buyers and to keep a low profile on the street. Investigators needed a witness with close ties to the crew. They distributed business cards, hoping one would find its way to an insider willing to talk. Their persistence paid off. In April 1994, a crew member contacted the C11 squad because he realized his life was in danger. He said the Preacher had started going after his own crew members. Preacher had killed 2 of the informant's partners. Fearing he was next, he asked Sergeant James Marr for protection.
Who was a stone-cold killer himself, who became an informant that was so fearful of Preacher and of being killed like his partners had, that he came to me, that he came to us, that he gave us information on specific crimes, that he talked about crimes that had been unsolved for years.
Investigators were frustrated that the informant knew nothing of 12-year-old Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. But he did give investigators their first specific insider information about Preacher Heatley's organization. He mentioned a killing basement that the crew used as a meeting place and execution chamber. At some meetings, Preacher would call for a vote on the fate of gang members who had fallen out of favor. If the majority voted thumbs down, Preacher ordered a murder. In March 1994, Preacher called for a vote on Malik, the janitor who had done the drive-by shooting. He believed Malik could no longer be trusted. The vote was thumbs down.
Yeah, what's up?
Preacher summoned Malik to headquarters.
How y'all doing? All right, most love, man. Most love, man. Most love. How you doing? I ain't seen you in a long time. What you been at, man? Most love. Know it, man. How it is.
Malik thought he was there to take part in the beating of a crew member that he had had problems with in the past.
Jay, I know he's slinging, man. All right? Word.
Not realizing he was the real target, Malik was excited when others invited him to the basement.
If you went down there and you were followed in there, you know, somebody was behind you, you weren't coming out alive.
Yo, Sean, let's go get this dude, Sean. Let's go get him. We're gonna do this dude, man. Real, yo. Yo, oh, shit. Priest, what's up, man? What's up? What you doing? Oh, man. Yo, Preach, man, come on, man.
Preacher told Malik he had to die. He was gaining too much influence within the organization. Preacher wouldn't tolerate it. Malik pleaded for his life. But the order had been given.
Grab the saw, Sean. Clean him up.
At Preacher's command, other janitors used a circular saw to dismember Malik. The informant said that Preacher ordered him and another crew member to dispose of the body parts.
This is the guy you work for, right?
They poured acid on Malik's arms to remove gang tattoos that could link him to the crew. Then they left the body parts in several crumbling, abandoned buildings.
They kept Malik's head in a refrigerator for a couple of weeks, and they kind of paraded it around on a stick. You know, that's how Preacher would, keep the fear of God, so to speak, in the younger Turks in his organization.
The fear was too much for the informant, though he knew leaving the crew was equivalent to a death sentence. He hoped the C-11 squad could protect him. It didn't take long for word to get back to the Preacher that the informant had cooperated. One day, the informant was leaving a New York courthouse when he spotted Preacher in cuff. He was sure they were there to abduct and kill him. He went to his car and called his C-11 handlers.
The informant advised me that his fear that he was going to be killed by the organization, he was going to be abducted, right in the middle of the afternoon in front of the courthouse.
The agents of C-11 rushed to stop another murder in the Preacher's territory.
I'm scared to death.
A former member of the Preacher crew feared the gang was out to kill him for cooperating with authorities. Agents and detectives from the FBI C-11 squad came to his aid just in time. They arrested Maine Lieutenant John Cuff and the crew leader himself, Clarence Preacher Heatley. Sergeant James Marr and the other arresting agents searched the vehicle.
What do we got here?
There was evidence inside, including information about my informant, masks, tape. It was apparent at the time that my informant's feelings were right. He was going to be abducted that day.
Come on, man.
But no one could prove that the men were coming to kill the informant.
20 minutes is all it took. I told you.
The preacher and Cuff were released.
Come on, man. I got things to do, man. Hurry up.
The incident brought the C-11 squad's investigation of the crew into the open.
20 minutes, all it took.
Have a nice day.
Nice day, officer.
That's when it became apparent that they were being investigated by the FBI. I mean, here's this detective that they know from the 3-2, that when he does make an arrest, makes arrests with FBI agents. It became apparent to Cuff and Preacher that the FBI was breathing down their neck.
Preacher further insulated himself. The FBI would have to get him by going after his organization. To prosecute, they would use federal racketeering statutes known as RICO. Originally designed to bring down organized crime families, RICO requires that strict criteria are met, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
You have to have your organization, you have to have your leader, which in this case was Preacher, and he has to have 5 or more people working underneath him, you know, to facilitate the conspiracy of the organization. But you also need 3 predicate offenses, 3 federal offenses.
The C-11 investigators surveilled the Preacher crew, gathering evidence on offenses to support the RICO case. They noticed unrest within the gang. It seemed the pressure of C-11's investigation was getting to the Preacher. From an informant, agents learned he even ordered the murder of his Maine lieutenant, John Cuff. Agents were obligated to warn Cuff of the hit.
I reached for my shield. He goes, "I know who you are. You don't have to show me your shield." I said, "You know, John, I just wanted to let you know that there's a contract out in your life, and I swear there's nothing but space when you look in his eyes." And he goes, "Everybody wants me dead."
Coming in, man. Come on, man.
Cuff was undaunted by the threat. Though the Preacher was tightening his grip on his men, investigators still needed to get evidence of the crimes the crew committed to support the racketeering organization. As more buyers and sellers were arrested, some agreed to cooperate, helping to outline the group in detail, according to Detective Vinnie Flynn.
We obtained the informants through narcotics investigations, arrests made by the 3-2 precinct and the 3-2 detective squad, through information they developed and informants they developed. Because of arrest, information was compiled, which built a case against the Preacher crew.
About some murders. What murders do you know about?
Unfortunately, no one had information on the Donnell Porter murder.
There was this girl who went to the park, you know, and so we took her back.
But one arrested crew member offered details of another murder committed by the crew, hoping for leniency. He said they decided they didn't want to pay for a shipment of drugs. They told the supplier that a young woman had stolen them and that they would take care of her. She was a single mother who sometimes worked as a courier for the crew.
Did you see what we whacked?
They brought her to a Harlem apartment, telling her they wanted her to hear a record they had produced.
Look it up.
She hadn't stolen any drugs. that didn't matter to the crew. The informant explained how they cleaned up the crime scene, then dumped the body in an abandoned building. He couldn't remember exactly which building it was. In August 1996, after more than 5 years of meticulous investigation, the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York decided they had enough for indictments and arrests on federal RICO charges. The first indictment was against Clarence Preacher Heatley and John Cuff. The indictment was kept sealed. If word got out to the preacher, he might disappear forever. Investigators staked out Preacher's Harlem headquarters. They hoped news of the indictments hadn't been leaked, and that if they found him, they could arrest him without a fight. They knew Preacher was surrounded by armed men, willing to kill at his command. In late 1996, the C-11 squad was ready to arrest Clarence Preacher Heatley. No one had seen him in days. On August 12th, he emerged from his headquarters building. Detectives made sure he was alone, then moved in.
Preacher, drop the phone! Drop the phone! Drop the phone! Let me see your hands! Get on the car! Get on the car! Get on the car! Hands on the car! Hands on the car!
As he was arrested, the elusive gang leader remained relaxed and confident. As soon as he was in custody, other teams arrested his main lieutenant, John Cuff. 2 months later, 15 more Preacher crew members were indicted. Arrest teams prepared for simultaneous takedowns. They had to strike fast, full force, to arrest gang members safely. Detective Vinnie Flynn and other C-11 investigators developed more cooperating witnesses among the arrested crew members.
Once people were arrested and being prosecuted, they agreed to cooperate, and they felt that they were used by the Preacher crew, and felt that if, in some cases, if they didn't participate, they would have been killed too. So this was their way out of the Preacher crew and from under Clarence Heatley's control.
Investigators learned in which Harlem buildings the crew dumped some of their victims. Finding physical evidence was crucial in order to prosecute the RICO case. One building was a shell, partially collapsed on the inside, further complicating the retrieval. After days of excavating tons of rubble, a body was discovered. Lab examiners determined it was the body of the young mother who had been killed as a cover for stolen drugs. She had been shot in an apartment in an adjacent building. Evidence response teams checked the apartment.
That's the apartment where they kept the Malik's head. And in the refrigerator, there was a lot of blood still left in the apartment. And inside the refrigerator, there was Malik's blood from where they kept his head. They were able to trace that at the lab.
Malik and several others had been killed in the basement of the Preacher's headquarters. Crime scene technicians processed the basement. Arrested crew members said Preacher had them scrub the place with boric acid after each killing. Most of the basement was clean.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there you go, right there.
But technicians were able to recover traces of blood on the windows and on the saw blade that had been used to dismember Malik. But the investigation was not over. The abduction and murder of young Donnell Porter was still unsolved.
Come on in, gentlemen. Have a seat.
Answers about his death finally came from an unlikely source. An assistant district attorney convinced the boy's uncle, preacher crew member John Apple Porter, to come in to talk. He was one of the crew's main players left on the street and had been labeled a snitch. 2 attempts had been made on his life. The DA suggested that Porter cooperate to earn protection in prison. He confessed to several murders and revealed what happened to his nephew Donnell. According to Sergeant James Marr, the kidnapping was prompted by jealousy and greed.
The underlying factor with Johnny Porter, Johnny Apples, with the kidnapping was when he came home from prison, Richie Porter, his nephew, was this big Harlem drug dealer. He was getting paid. Richie Porter used to wear a lot of gold, used to really like flashy cars. He was making a lot of money, and he wasn't giving any to Johnny Porter. And Johnny Porter felt he was owed this, and he decided to take it. And the way he took it is he snatched the kid.
Porter said the preacher agreed to the kidnapping. He sent one of his janitors, Malik, to help. They believed Richard Porter would pay anything to get his brother back.
No.
They kept the boy in a basement where no one would hear him.
What's up, Sean? We'll make a take for us.
They cut off his finger and recorded the boy's pleas for help to prove to his family they were serious. Apple and Preacher hoped for $500,000, enough to set Apple up in his own drug trade and enough to cripple Richard Porter.
What time was it?
When Richard couldn't come up with that amount of cash, they lowered it to $350,000.
Did you hold that in his hand?
Then the unexpected happened. Preacher and Apple learned that Richard Porter was murdered. There'd be no ransom.
You sure about that?
Make the call.
Preacher Heatley later told Special Agent Joe Walsh about his decision.
Preacher sat right down in a room and told me exactly what happened. He looked me right in the eye and said, I couldn't let that boy live after what had happened.
Yeah.
John Porter insisted that it was Malik who actually did the killing. Malik was later killed and dismembered at the preacher's command.
You're gonna think twice about it.
John Porter was sentenced to natural life. Because of the evidence collected by the C-11 squad, each member of the preacher crew went to prison. Their leader, Clarence Preacher Heatley, pled guilty to federal racketeering charges that included drug trafficking, assault, and murder. He was sentenced to life with no chance of parole. He and his crew will never again terrorize the streets of Harlem.
It's estimated that they're responsible for approximately 45 murders that we're aware of. Numerous robberies. If you add the extortion in, these people were a decade-long or better crime wave in themselves. They were just amazing, the devastation that they caused in these communities.
That changed when the C-11 squad dismantled the preacher crew forever. Since the case was closed, Harlem has seen a rebirth.
Harlem today, the 32nd precinct, is running somewhere between 15 and 20 homicides a year, down from the 70s, down from 70 a year in the late 80s during the crack cocaine binge. I think we accomplished quite a bit with this case. And the drug organization doesn't exist anymore, so we can't hurt anybody else.